Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairy Tales. Though you may have already caught me in the beginning there, as I made a bit of a mistake. This is the show where we read old folk tales and fairy tales on varietal literature. If you've never been here before, well, welcome. This month, of course, is the spooky month. So we are going to be reading stuff to do with, horror. My name is Rory, and tonight we're going to read a story called The Child That Went with the Fairies. And it's from an Irish writer called Sheridan Le Fanu, who is a fairly pioneering writer and basically wrote Dracula before Dracula. Tonight's story doesn't have anything to do with that, but he sort of pioneered a lot of the Victorian ghost stories. And I guess as a sort of preamble, let me clarify a couple of things about this particular channel and show. Music feels a little loud to me, so I'm going to turn it down. Now, the thing about, sorry. The thing about this channel is it's never really been intended for kids. I don't market us for kids. It's folktales and fairy tales. However, I think it's fair to say that a majority of the time you can actually watch it with, a kid of a reasonable age. However, in the month of October, our content is pretty adult. It is tied to Victorian era, so there isn't a lot of gratuitous, gory kind of stuff. And there's not really any kind of sexualized content that I know of that's coming or anything. But what is here is sort of genuinely creepy adult stuff. So if you do happen to watch this with your family or something, just be aware that this is on the more adult side for about 4 weeks here. The second thing I'm going to say was about Sheridan Le Fanu. Sheridan Le Fanu, again, an Irish writer from the Victorian era, sort of dead set in the middle of it. And while he's not as heard of anymore, he is kind of credited for starting the Victorian ghost story trend, or at least setting a lot of the standards of it. Now, as a personal note to the title of this stream, I generally don't find written stories all that creepy. I find them more atmospheric. I like them. They're fun. But I don't really... Edgar Allan Poe's never really scared me or anything. This story genuinely freaked me out a bit. I don't want to oversell it. It's still a story. It's still, a work of fiction, you're sure. But, it's creepy. And part of what makes it creepy is in the sort of a turn it takes a little bit later. So, all I would say is give the story a chance, get to the end. And then depending on how long it takes to read this story, we'll probably read another story from Sheridan Le Fanu. Technically a chapter of a book. But if we get to that point, we'll definitely only be reading the two. They're both medium length. All right. That's all I really wanted to say here. So this story is from Sheridan Le Fanu, spelled Lefanu, if you're trying to find him yourself. Volume 5 of his ghostly tales. And the tale itself is called The Child That Went with the Fairies. As a note here, there is a lot of sort of rural Irish slang that I've made the decision I'm simply going to use the modern English equivalents of a lot of it, because it gets to the point where I don't think you'd be able to follow if I didn't, or unless you already knew Irish slang that well. Eastward of the old city of Limerick, about 10 Irish miles under the range of mountains known as Slaveelum Hills, famous as having afforded Sarsfield a shelter among their rocks and hollows when he crossed them in his gallant descent upon the cannon and ammunition of King William on its way to the beleaguering army. There runs a very old and narrow road. It connects the Limerick Road to Tipperary with the old road from Limerick to Dublin, and runs by bog and pasture, hill and hollow, straw-thatched village and roofless castle, not far from 20 miles. Skirting the healthy mountains of which I have spoken, at one point it becomes singularly lonely. For more than 3 Irish miles, it traverses a deserted country, a wide black bog level as a lake, skirted with copse. Spreads at the left as you journey northward. And the long and irregular line of mountain rises at the right, clothed in heath, broken with lines of grey rock that resemble the bold and irregular outlines of fortifications, and riven with many a gully expanding here and there into rocky and wooded glens, which open as they approach the road. A scanty pasturage, on which browsed a few scattered sheep or kine, skirts this solitary road for some miles, and under shelter of a hillock, and of 2 or 3 great ash trees, stood not many years ago the little thatched cabin of a widow named Mary Ryan. Poor was this widow in a land of poverty. The thatch had acquired the grey tint and sunken outlines that show how the alterations of rain and sun have told upon that perishable shelter. But whatever other dangers threatened, there was one well provided against by the care of other times. Round the cabin stood 6 mountain ashes, as the Rowans, inimical to witches, are they called. On the worn planks of the door were nailed 2 horseshoes, and over the lintel and spreading along the thatch grew luxuriant patches of that ancient cure for many maladies, and prophylactic against the machinations of the evil one, the house leek. Descending into the doorway, in the chiaroscuro of the interior, when your eye grew sufficiently accustomed to that dim light, you might discover, hanging at the head of the widow's wooden-roofed bed, her beads and a phial of holy water. Here certainly were defenses and bulwarks against the intrusion of that unearthly and evil power, of whose vicinity this solitary family were constantly reminded by the outline of the Lys Navora, that lonely hill haunt of the good people, as the fairies are called euphemistically, whose strangely dome-like summit rose not a half-mile away, looking like an outwork of the long line of mountains that sweeps by it. It was at the fall of the leaf, and an autumnal sunset through the lengthening shadow of the haunted Lys Navora, which basically means fairy hill in Irish Gaelic. Close in front of the solitary little cabin, over the undulating slopes and sides of the Slevy Elim, the birds were singing among the branches in the thinning leaves of the melancholy ash trees that grew at the roadside in front of the door, The widow's 3 younger children were playing on the road, and their voices mingled with the evening song of the birds. Their elder sister Nell, who was within in the house, as their phrase is, seeing after the boiling of the potatoes for supper. Their mother had gone down to the bog to carry up a hamper of turf on her back. It was, or was at least, a charitable custom, and if not disused, long may it continue, for the wealthier people, when cutting their turf and stacking it in the bog, to make a smaller stack for the behoof of the poor, who were welcome to take from it so long as it lasted, and thus the potato pot was kept boiling, and the hearth warm that would have been cold enough but for that good-natured bounty through wintry months. Moll Ryan trudged up the steep Bohareen, whose banks were overgrown with thorn and brambles, and stooping under her burden, re-entered her door, where her dark-haired daughter Nell met her with a welcome and relieved her of her hamper. Moll Ryan looked round with a sigh of relief, and drying her forehead, uttered the Munster ejaculation, "Here, washa! It's tired I am with it. God bless it. Where's the creatures, Nell?" Which means, where are my kids? "Playing out on the road, Mother. Didn't you see them coming up?" "No. There was no one before me on the road," she said uneasily. "Not a soul, Nell. And why didn't you keep an eye on them?" "Well, they're in the haggard, playing there, or round by the back of the house. Will I call them in?" "Do so, good girl. In the name of God. The hens is coming home, you see, and the sun was just down over Knockdoola, and I coming up." So out ran tall, dark-haired Nell, standing on the road, look up and down it, but not a sign of her 2 little brothers, Con and Bill, or her little sister Peg could she see. She called them, but no answer came from the little haggard, fenced with straggling bushes. She listened, but the sound of their voices was missing. Over the stile and behind the house she ran, but there all was silent and deserted. She looked down toward the bog, as far as she could see, but they did not appear. Again she listened, but in vain. At first she had felt angry, but now a different feeling overcame her, and she grew pale. With an undefined boding, she looked toward the healthy boss of Lis Navara, now darkening on to the purple, deepest purple against the flaming sky of the sunset. Again she listened with a sinking heart, and heard nothing but the farewell twitter and whistle of birds in the bushes around. How many stories had she listened to by the winter hearth, of children stolen by the fairies at nightfall in lonely places such as this. With this fear she knew her mother was haunted. No one in the country round gathered her little flock about her so early as this frightened widow, and no door in the 7 parishes was barred so early. Sufficiently fearful, as all young people in that part of the world are, of such dreaded and subtle agents, Nell was even more than usually afraid of them, for her terrors were infected and redoubled by her mother's. She was looking towards Lis Navara in a trance of fear, and crossed herself again and again, and whispered prayer after prayer. She was interrupted by her mother's voice on the road, calling her loudly. She answered and ran round to the front of the cabin, where she found her standing. "And where in the world's the creatures? Did you see sight of them anywhere?" cried Mrs. Ryan, as the girl came over the stile. "Ah, Mother, 'tis only what they ran down the road a bit. We'll see them coming back this minute. It's like goats they are, climbing here and running there, and if I had them here in my hand, maybe I wouldn't give them a hiding all around." "May the Lord forgive you, Nell. The childers are gone. They're took, and not a soul near us, and Father Tom 3 miles away, and what'll I do? And who's to help us this night? Oh, what is rue? The creatures are gone. Whisht, mother, be easy. Don't you see them coming up? And then she shouted in menacing accents and waving her arms and beckoning the children who were seen approaching on the road, which some little way off made a slight dip, which had concealed them. They were approaching from the westward and from the direction of the dreaded hill, Lis Navara. But there were only 2 of the children, and one of them, the little girl, was crying. Their mother and sister hurried forward to meet them, more alarmed than ever. "Where is Billy? Where is he?" cried the mother, nearly breathless, as soon as she was within hearing. "He's gone. They took him away. But they said he'll come back again," answered little Con with the dark brown hair. "He's gone away with grand ladies," blubbered the little girl. "What ladies? Where? Oh, Liam Astora! My darling, are you gone away at last? Where is he? Who took him? What ladies are you talking about? What way did he go?" she cried in distraction. "I couldn't see where he went, mother. 'Twas like as if he was going to Lis Navara." With a wild exclamation, the distracted woman ran on towards the hill, alone, clapping her hands and crying aloud the name of her lost child, Billy. Scared and horrified Nell, not daring to follow her to the fairy hill, gazed after her and burst into tears. And the other children raised nigh their lamentations and shrill rivalry. Twilight was deepening. It was long past the time when they were usually barred securely within their habitation, and Nell led the younger children into the cabin and made them sit down by the turf fire, while she stood in the open door watching in great fear for the return of her mother. After a long while, they did see their mother return. She came in, sat down by the fire, and cried as if her heart would break. "Will I bar the door, mother?" asked Nell. "I do. Didn't I lose enough this night without having the door open for more years to go? But first take a sprinkle of dust of the holy waters over you, Ashkula, and bring it here till I throw a taste of it over myself and the creatures. And I wonder, Nell, you'd forget to do the like for yourself, letting the creatures out so near nightfall. Come here and sit on my knees, Astora. Come to me, Mavorine, and hold me fast in the name of God, and I'll hold you fast that none can take yous from me, and tell me all about it, what it was the Lord between us and harm, and how it happened, and who was in it." Well, the door being barred, the 2 children, sometimes speaking together, often interrupting one another, began to tell this strange story, which I had better relate connectedly and in my own language. The widow Ryan's 3 children were playing, as I have said, upon the narrow old road in front of her door. Little Bill, or Liam, about 5 years old, with golden hair and large blue eyes, was a very pretty boy, with all the clear tints of healthy childhood, and that gaze of earnest simplicity which belongs not to town children of the same age. His little sister Peg, about a year older, and his brother Con, a little more than a year elder than she, made up the little group. Under the great old ash tree, whose last leaves were falling at their feet in the light of an October sunset, they were playing with the hilarity and eagerness of rustic children, clamoring together, and their faces were turned toward the west and storied hill of Lis Navara. Suddenly, a startling voice with a screech called to them from behind, ordering them to get out of the way. And turning, they saw a sight such as they've never beheld before. It was a carriage drawn by 4 horses, and they were pawing and snorting in impatience as it just pulled up. The children were almost under their feet and scrambled to the side of the road next to their own door. Well, this carriage and all its appointments were old-fashioned and gorgeous, and presented to the children who had never seen anything finer than a turf car, and once an old chaise that passed that way from Killaloe, a spectacle perfectly dazzling. Here was antique splendor. The harness and trappings were scarlet and blazing with gold. The horses were huge. Taking a water break here. The harness and trappings were scarlet and blazing with gold. The horses were huge and snow white with great manes that, as they tossed and shook them in the air, seemed to stream and float, sometimes longer and sometimes shorter. Like so much smoke, their tails were long and tied up in bows of broad scarlet and gold ribbon. The coach itself was glowing with colors, gilded and emblazoned. There were footmen in gay liveries and 3 cocked hats like the coachman's. But he had a wig like a judge's, and their hair was frizzed out and powdered, and a long, thick pigtail with a bow to it hung down the back of each. All these servants were diminutive and ludicrously out of proportion with the enormous horses of the equipage, and had sharp, sallow features and small, restless, fiery eyes, and faces of cunning and malice that chilled the children. The little coachman was scowling and showing his white fangs under his cocked hat, and his little blazing beads of eyes were quivering with fury in their socket as he whirled his whip around over their heads, till the lash of it looked like a streak of fire in the evening sun and sounded like the cry of a legion of philoppeques in the air. "Stop the princess on the highway!" cried the coachman in a piercing treble. "Stop the princess on the highway!" piped each footman in turn, scowling over his shoulder down on the children and grinding his keen teeth. The children were so frightened they could only gape and turn white in their panic. But a very sweet voice from the open door of the carriage reassured them and arrested the attack of the lackeys. A beautiful and very grand-looking lady was smiling from it on them, and they all felt pleased in the strange light of that smile. "The boy with the golden hair, I think," said the lady, bending her large and wonderfully clear eyes on little Liam. The upper sides of the carriage were chiefly of glass, so that the children could see another woman inside, whom they did not like so well. This woman was of black complexion and had a wonderfully long neck, hung round with many strings of large, variously colored beads, and on her head was a turban of silk striped with all colors of the rainbow, and fixed in it was a gold star. This woman had a face as thin almost as a death's head, with high cheekbones and great goggle eyes, the whites of which, as well as her wide range of teeth, showed in brilliant contrast with her skin as she looked over the beautiful lady's shoulder and whispered something in her ear. "Yes, the boy with the golden hair, I think," repeated the lady. And her voice sounded as sweet as a silver bell to the children's ears, and her smile beguiled them with the light of an enchanted lamp, as she leaned from the window with a look of ineffable fondness on that golden-haired boy with the large blue eyes, insomuch that little Billy, looking up, smiled in return with a wondering fondness. And when she stooped down, she stretched her jeweled arms towards him, and he stretched his little hands up. And how they touched, the other children did not know, but saying, "Come, give me a kiss, my darling." She raised him and seemed to ascend in her small fingers as lightly as a feather. She held him in her lap and covered him with kisses. Nothing daunted, the other children would have been only too happy to change places with their favored little brother. There was only one thing that was unpleasant and frightened them, and that was the black woman, who stood and stretched forward in the carriage as before. She gathered a rich silk and gold handkerchief that was in her fingers up to her lips, and seemed to thrust ever so much of it, fold after fold, into her capacious mouth, as they thought to smother her laughter, with which she seemed convulsed, for she was shaking and quivering, as it seemed, with suppressed merriment. But her eyes, which remained uncovered, looked angrier than they'd ever seen eyes look before. But the lady was so beautiful they looked on her instead, and she continued to caress and kissed the little boy on her knee. Smiling at the other children, she held up a large russet apple in her fingers, and the carriage began to move slowly on with a nod, inviting them to take the fruit. She dropped it on the road from the window, and it rolled some way beside the wheels, they following, and then she dropped another, and then another, and so on. And the same thing happened to all, for just as either of the children who ran beside had caught the rolling apple, somehow it slipped into a hole or ran into a ditch. And looking up, they saw the lady drop another from the window, and so the chase was taken up and continued till they got, hardly knowing how far they'd gone, to the old crossroads that leads to Oni. It seemed that there the horses' hooves and carriage wheels rolled up a wonderful dust, which being caught in one of those eddies that whirl the dust up into a column on the calmest day, enveloped the children for a moment and passed whirling on towards Lis Navara. The carriage, as they fancied, driving in the center of it, but suddenly it subsided. The straws and leaves floated to the ground. The dust dissipated itself, but the white horses and the lackeys, the gilded carriage, the lady, and their little golden-haired brother Billy were gone. At the same moment, suddenly the upper rim of the clear setting sun disappeared behind the hill of Nakdula, and it was twilight. Each child felt the transition like a shock. In the sight of the rounded summit of Lis Navara now closely overhanging them, struck them with a new fear. They screamed their brother's name after him, but their cries were lost in the vacant air. At the same time, they thought they heard a hollow voice say close to them, "Go home." Looking round and seeing no one, they were scared, and hand in hand, the little girl crying wildly and the boy as white as ashes from fear, they trotted homeward at their best speed to tell, as we have seen, their strange story. Molly Ryan never saw her darling again. But something of the lost little boy was seen by his former playmates. Sometimes when their mother was away, earning a trifle at haymaking, and Nellie washing the potatoes for their dinner, or beetling clothes in the little stream that flows in the hollow close by, they saw the pretty face of little Billy peeping in archly at the door and smiling silently at them. And as they ran to embrace him, with cries of delight, he drew back, still smiling archly. And when they got out into the open day, he was gone, and they could see no trace of him anywhere. This happened often, with slight variations in the circumstances of the visit. Sometimes he would peep for a longer time, sometimes for a shorter time. Sometimes his little hand would come in, and with bended finger beckon them to follow. But always he was smiling, with the same arch look and wary silence. And always he was gone when they reached the door. Gradually, these visits grew less and less frequent, and in about 8 months, they ceased altogether, and little Billy, irretrievably lost, took rank in their memories with the dead. One wintry morning, however, nearly a year and a half after his disappearance, their mother having set out for Limerick soon after cockcrow, to sell some fowls at the market, the little girl, lying by the side of her elder sister, who was fast asleep, just at the grey of the morning, heard the latch on the door lift softly, saw little Billy enter and close the door gently after him. There was light enough to see he was barefoot and ragged, and looked pale and famished. He went straight to the fire and cowered over the turf embers and rubbed his hands together slowly and seemed to shiver as he gathered the smoldering turf together. The little girl clutched her sister in terror and whispered, "Waken, Nellie, waken, here's Billy come back." But Nellie slept soundly on. The little boy, whose hands were extended close over the coals, turned and looked toward the bed. It seemed to her in fear, and she saw the glare of the embers reflected on his thin cheek as he turned towards her. He rose and went on tiptoe quickly to the door in silence and let himself out as softly as he had come in. After that, the little boy was never seen any more by any one of his kindred. Fairy doctors, as the dealers in the preternatural, who in such cases were called in and are termed, did all that in them lay but in vain. Father Tom came down and tried what holier rites could do, but equally without result. So little Billy was dead to mother, brother, and sister. But no grave received him. Others whom affection cherished lay in holy ground in the old churchyard of Abington, with headstone to mark the spot over which the survivor might kneel and say a kind prayer for the peace of the departed soul. But there was no landmark to show where little Billy was hidden from their loving eyes, unless it was in the old hill of Lis Navara, cast its long shadow at sunset before the cabin door, where that white and filmy in the moonlight in later years would occupy his brother's gaze as he returned from fair or market, and draw from him a sigh and a prayer for his little brother he had lost so long ago and was never to see again. And that is the child that went with the fairies. GS says, I love the coachman's descriptions, and I think I'm afraid of fairies now. Yeah, I think I better understand why so many people in Ireland were afraid of fairies, if I'm being honest. For me, like, being captured by the fairies, it was creepy and all that. It was creepier than I thought it would be. But the returning of the boy, smiling and at random times in some quiet farmhouse door. Whew. Man alive, did I not expect that. Well, we're on a weird thing where, like, I can choose to go long. The next one is a little sillier. It's not as creepy. Like, it's definitely a step down in creepiness. I still think it's got its creepy elements, but it's also from Sheridan Le Fanu. Sure. We only read these kinds of stories once a year, so why not? GS says it's his last visit that creeped me out. Yeah, like, it's a real talent for this guy to write what shouldn't be in writing all that impactful. Something that you're like, what the hell is going on? Okay. Gonna drink a little bit of water. I'm less practiced at this one, so there's a chance that I'm going to trip a little more on the Irish slang. Unfortunately, like, there's no getting around the Irish accent because he's written it into the actual dialogue, which is an old practice I've talked about before. But, yeah. So you'll notice that this says Chapter 12. So what we're going to read is an excerpt from a book that I don't fully understand because I haven't read the whole book. I was recommended this excerpt. It's also from Sheridan Le Fanu. It's a book called The House by the Churchyard. But this chapter is kind of famous for being pretty much a standalone account. Now, the book itself is a mixture of a novel and historical content. So it is presented somewhat literally by the author as being a thing that has occurred. This one is on the cornier side, but I think it's still fun. Whereas the last one, not so much fun, kind of just scary. So this is an excerpt from the book House by the Churchyard by Sheridan Le Fanu. And it has a few different names, this chapter. Sometimes it's called The Tiled House. Mostly it's called The Ghost of a Hand. But here it is called Some Odd Facts About the Tiled House, being an authentic narrative of the ghost of a hand. So you understand, it is an excerpt from a larger book. It stands alone as a chapter, but we get this introduction from a narrator that you wouldn't really know without knowing the book. I'm sure she believed every word she related, for old Sally was veracious. But All this was worth just so much talk commonly is. Marvels, fabulae, what our ancestors called winter's tales, which gathered details from every narrator and dilated in the act of narration. Still, it was not quite for nothing that the house was held to be haunted. Under all this smoke smoldered just a little spark of truth. An authenticated mystery, for the solution of which some of my readers may possibly suggest a theory, though I confess I can't. Miss Rebecca Chatsworth, in a letter dated in the autumn of 1753, gives a minute and curious relation of occurrences in the tiled house, which, it is plain, although at starting she protests against all such fooleries, she has heard with a peculiar sort of interest and relates it certainly with an awful sort of particularity. 1753 would have been about 100 years before this book was written. I was for printing the entire letter, which is really a very singular as well as characteristic. But my publisher meets me with his veto, and I believe he is right. The worthy old lady's letter is perhaps too long, and I must rest content with a few hungry notes of its tenor. That year, 1753, and somewhere about the 24th of October, there broke out a strange dispute between Mr. Alderman Harper of High Street, Dublin, and my Lord Castlemyard, who, in virtue of his cousinship with the young heir's mother, had undertaken for him the management of the tiny estate on which the tiled with a Y, house, for I find it spelt both ways, stood. This Alderman Harper had agreed for a lease of the house for his daughter, who was married to a gentleman named Prosser. He furnished it and put up hangings and otherwise went to considerable expense. Mr. and Mrs. Prosser came there sometime in June, and after having parted with a good many servants in the interval, she made up her mind that she could not live in the house, and her father waited on Lord Castlemyard and told him plainly that he could not take out the lease because the house was subjected to annoyances which he could not explain. In plain terms, he said it was haunted, and that no servants would live there more than a few weeks, and that after his son-in-law's family had suffered there, not only should he be excused from taking a lease of it, but that the house itself ought to be pulled down as a nuisance and the habitual haunt of something worse than human malefactors. The Lord filled a bill on the equity side of the exchequer to compel Mr. Alderman Harper to perform his contract by taking out the lease, but the alderman drew an answer, supported by no less than 7 long affidavit copies, all of which were furnished to his lordship, and with the desired effect. For rather than compel him to place them upon the file of the court, his lordship struck to release him. I am sorry the cause did not proceed at least far enough to place upon the files of the court the very authentic and unaccountable story which Miss Rebecca relates. So to summarize that, he is summarizing a real sort of exchange of this house that about 100 years ago somebody was supposed to take care of, and then he refused because he said it was horrifying, and eventually it was granted to him. But the record of why wasn't on those official records. Instead, we find why he went through all that effort in a letter from the lady. And its summary is as follows. The annoyances described did not begin until the end of August, when one evening Mrs. Prosser, quite alone, was sitting in the twilight at the back parlor window, which was open, looking out into the orchard, and plainly saw a hand, stealthily placed upon the stone wooden windowsill, as if by some one beneath the window at her right side, intending to climb up. There was nothing but the hand, which was rather short, but handsomely formed, and white and plump, laid on the edge of the windowsill. It was not a very young hand, but one aged, somewhere about 40, as she conjectured. It was only a few weeks before the horrible robbery at Clondalkin had taken place, and the lady fancied that the hand was that of one of the miscreants who was now about to scale the windows of the tiled house. So she uttered a loud scream and an ejaculation of terror, and at the same moment, the hand was quietly withdrawn. Search was made in the orchard, but no indications of any persons having been under the window, beneath which, ranged along the wall, stood a great column of flower pots, which it seemed might have prevented anyone from coming within reach of it. The same night there came a hasty tapping every now and then at the window of the kitchen. So the woman grew frightened, and the servant man, taking firearms with him, opened the back door, but discovered nothing. As he shut it, however, he said, "A thump came on it, and a pressure, as if somebody striving to force his way in, which frightened him. And though the tapping went on upon the kitchen window panes, he made no further explanation or exploration. About 6 o'clock on the Saturday evening following, the cook, an honest, sober woman, now aged nigh 60 years, being alone in the kitchen, saw on looking up, it is supposed, the same fat, aristocratic-looking hand laid with its palm against the glass near the side of the window, at this time moving slowly up and down, pressed all white all the while against the glass, as if feeling carefully for some inequality on its surface. She cried out and said something like a prayer on seeing it, but it was not withdrawn for several seconds after. After this, for a great many nights, there came at first a low and afterwards an angry rapping, as it seemed with a set of clenched knuckles at the back door. And the servant man would not open it, but called to know who was there. And there came no answer. Only a sound, as if the palm of the hand was slowly placed against it, and drawn slowly from side to side with a sort of soft, groping motion. All this time, sitting in the back parlor, which for the time they used as a drawing room, Mr. and Mrs. Prosser were disturbed by the rappings at the window. Sometimes very low and furtive, like a clandestine signal, and others sudden and so loud as to threaten the breaking of the pane. This was all at the back of the house, which looked upon the orchard, as you know. But on a Tuesday night at about 9:30, there came precisely the same rapping at the hall door, and went on, to the great annoyance of the master and the terror of his wife, at intervals for nearly 2 hours. After this, for several days and nights, they had no annoyance whatsoever, and began to think the nuisance had expended itself. But on the night of the 13th of September, Jane Easterbrook, an English maid, had gone into the pantry for the small silver bowl in which her mistress's posset was served, happening to look up at the little window of only 4 panes, observed through an auger hole which was drilled through the window frame for the admission of a bolt to secure the shutter, a white, pudgy finger. At first the tip, and then the 2 first joints introduced and turned about this way and that, crooked against the inside, as if searching of a fastening which its owner designed to push aside. When the maid got back into the kitchen, we are told she fell into a swoon, and was all the next day very weak. Mr. Prosser, I've heard, a hard-headed and conceited sort of fellow, scouted the ghost and sneered at the fears of his family. He was privately of opinion that the whole affair was a practical joke or a fraud, and waited an opportunity to catch the rogue flagrante delicto. He did not keep his this theory to himself, but let it out by degrees with no stint of oaths and threats, believing some domestic traitor held the thread of the conspiracy. Indeed, it was time something were done, for not only his servants, but good Mrs. Prosser herself, who grown to look unhappy and anxious. They kept at home from the hour of sunset, and would not venture about the house after nightfall, excepting couples. The knocking had ceased for about a week, when one night Mrs. Prosser, being in the nursery, her husband was in the parlor, heard it begin very softly at the hall door. The air was quiet and still, which favored his hearing distinctly, but this was the first time there had been any disturbance at that side of the house, and the character of the summons were changed. Mr. Prosser, leaving the parlor door open, it seems went quietly into the hall. The sound was that of beating on the outside of the stout door, softly and regularly, with the flat of the hand. He was going to open it suddenly, but changed his mind and went back very quietly, and on to the head of the kitchen stair, where was a strong closet over the pantry in which he kept his firearms, swords, and canes. Here he called his manservant, whom he believed to be honest, and with a pair of loaded pistols in his own coat pockets. And giving another pair to him, he went lightly as he could, followed by the man with a stout walking cane in his hand, forward to the door. Everything went as Mr. Prosser wished. The besieger of his house, so far from taking fright at their approach, grew more impatient. And the sort of padding which had aroused his attention at first assumed the rhythm and emphasis of a series of double knocks. Mr. Prosser, angry, opened the door with his right arm crossed, cane in hand, but looking, he saw nothing. Then his arm, up with the cane, jerked up oddly, as it might with the hollow of a hand, and something passed under it with a kind of gentle squeeze. The servant neither saw nor felt anything, and did not know why this master looked back so hastily, cutting with his cane and shutting the door with so sudden a slam. From that time, Mr. Prosser continued his angry talk and swearing about it, discontinued rather, and seemed nearly as averse from the subject as the rest of his family. He grew in fact very uncomfortable, feeling an inward persuasion that when, in answer to the summons, he'd opened the hall door, he'd actually given admission to the besieger. He said nothing to Mrs. Prosser, but went up earlier to his bedroom, where he read a while in his Bible and said his prayers. I hope the particular relation of the circumstances does not indicate its singularity. He lay awake a good while, it appears, and as he supposed, about 12:15, he heard the soft palm of a hand patting the outside of his bedroom door, and then brushed slowly along it. Up bounced Mr. Prosser, very much frightened, and locked the door, crying, "Who's there?" but receiving no answer, but the same brushing sound of a soft hand drawn over the panels, which he knew only too well. In the morning, the housemaid was terrified by the impression of a hand in the dust of the little parlor table, where they'd been unpacking Delft and the other things the day before. The print of the naked foot in the sea sand did not frighten Robinson Crusoe half so much. They were by this time all nervous, and some of them half crazed about the hand. Mr. Prosser went to examine the mark and made light of it, But as he swore afterwards, rather to quiet his servants from any comfortable feeling about it in his own mind, However, he had them all, one by one, into the room, and made each place his or her hand palm downward on the same table, and thus taking similar impressions from every person in the house, including himself and his wife, and his affidavit deposed that the formation of the hand so impressed differed altogether from those of the living inhabitants of the house, and corresponded with that of the hand seen by Mrs. Prosser and by the cook. Whoever or whatever the owner of that hand might be, they all felt this subtle demonstration to mean that it was declared he was no longer out of doors, but he had established himself in the house. And now, Mrs. Prosser began to be troubled with strange and horrible dreams, some of which, as set out in detail in Aunt Rebecca's long letter, are really very appalling nightmares. But one night, as Mr. Prosser closed his bedchamber door, he was struck somewhat by the utter silence of the room, there being no sound of breathing. It seemed unaccountable to him, as he knew his wife was in bed. His ears were particularly sharp. There was candle burning on a small table at the foot of the bed. Beside the one he held in one hand, a heavy ledger, connected with his father-in-law's business, being under his arm. He drew the curtains at the side of the bed and saw Mrs. Prosser lying, as for a few seconds he mortally feared, dead, her face being motionless, white, and covered with a cold dew. And on the pillow, close beside her head, and just within the curtains, was, as he first thought, a toad, but really the same fattish hand, and the wrist resting on the pillow, and the fingers extended toward her temples. Mr. Prosser, with a horrified jerk, pitched the ledger right at the curtains behind the owner of the hand, where they might be supposed to stand. The hand was instantaneously and smoothly snatched away, and the curtains made a great wave. And Mr. Prosser got round the bed in time to see the closet door, which was at the other side, pulled to by the same white puffy hand as he believed. He drew then the door open with a fling and stared in, but the closet was empty, except for the clothes hanging from the pegs on the walls and the dressing table and looking glass facing the windows. He shut it sharply and locked it, and felt for a moment, he says, as if he were like to lose his wits. Then, ringing at the bell, he brought the servants with much ado. They recovered Mrs. Prosser from a sort of trance, in which, he says, from her looks, she seemed to have suffered the pains of death. And Aunt Rebecca adds, from what she told me of her visions with her own lips, he might have added, and of hell also. But the occurrence which seems to have determined the crisis was the strange sickness of their eldest child, a little boy aged between 2 and 3 years. He lay awake, seemingly in paroxysms of terror, and the doctor who were called in set down the symptoms to incipient water on the brain. It's a classic. Mrs. Prosser used to sit up with the nurse by the nursery fire, much troubled in mind about the condition of her child. His bed was placed sideways along the wall, with its head against the door of a press or cupboard, which, however, did not shut quite close. There was a little valance, about a foot depth, round the top of the child's bed, and this descended within some 10 or 12 inches of the pillows on which it lay. They observed that the little creature was quieter whenever they took it up and held it on their laps. They had just replaced him, as he seemed to have grown quite sleepy and tranquil, but as he was not 5 minutes in his bed when he began to scream in one of his frenzies of terror. At the same moment, the nurse for the first time detected, and Mrs. Prosser equally plainly saw, following the direction of her eyes, the real cause of the child's suffering. protruding through the aperture of the press. Shrouded in the shade of the valance, they plainly saw the fat white hand, palm downwards, presented towards the head of the child. The mother uttered a scream and snatched the child from its little bed, and she and the nurse ran down to the ladies' sleeping room where Mr. Prosser was in bed, shutting the door as they entered, and they had hardly done so when a gentle tap came to it from the outside. Now, there is a great deal more in her letter, but this will suffice. The singularity of the narrative seems to me to be this, that it describes the ghost of a hand and no more. The person to whom that hand belonged never once appeared, nor was it a hand exactly separated from a body, but only a hand so manifested and introduced that its owner was always, by some crafty accident, hidden from view. In the year 1819, at a college breakfast, so this would be many years later, I met a Mr. Prosser, a thin, grave, but rather chatty old gentleman, with very white hair drawn back into a pigtail, and he told us all, with concise particularity, a story of his cousin, James Prosser, who, when an infant, had slept for some time in what his mother said was a haunted nursery in an old house near Chapelizod, and who, whenever he was ill, over-fatigued, or in any wise feverish, suffered all through his life as he had done from a time he could scarce remember, from a vision of a certain gentleman, fat and pale, every curl of whose wig, every button and fold of whose laced clothes, and every feature and line of whose sensual, benignant, and unwholesome face was minutely engraven upon his memory as the dress and lineaments of his own grandfather's portrait, which hung before him every day at breakfast, dinner, and supper. Mr. Prosser mentioned this an instance of curiously monotonous, individualized, and persistent nightmare, and hinted the extreme horror and anxiety with which his cousin, of whom he spoke in the past tense as poor Jemmy, was at any time induced to mention it. I hope the reader will pardon me for loitering so long in the tiled house, but this sort of lore has always had a charm for me, and people, you know, especially old people, will talk of what most interests themselves, too often forgetting that others may have had more than enough of it. And that is The Ghost of a Hand. GS says, never opening a knocking door at night. There's something about something knocking on your window at night that is so specifically scary. I read a tweet not long ago of a girl who was on third story in a new place, and someone knocked on their window that had like no stairs to it or whatever. It's probably a bird, right? But for that moment, GS also says this author does do creepy well. I think so. I think this one's a little more corny, you know, like a fat white hand is not necessarily as creepy as the other one, but he does build his atmosphere well. GS says, and I thought a spider on my pillow would be my worst nightmare. I think that would still be my worst nightmare. I don't know. Fat old aristocrat hand, maybe not. But GS also says that was very spooky. Well, we've gone a little over time, but we got our 2 stories in. I don't know who we're reading next week. Who knows? It could be more La Fan. GS says, an interesting that the child saw the whole man. And, you know, it's never explained why the man wants this child to be terrified, but he sure does, doesn't he? Well, I mean, just a quick reminder, I know it breaks the mood a bit, but tomorrow we are having our first discussion of My Indian Summer by Joseph Gagawinaganesam. We're reading up to the end of chapter 6, which in the physical print book is page 106. That's tomorrow night at 6:30 Pacific. Whatever time this started for you, it starts at the same time tomorrow. Don't miss it. We're only running this for 2 weeks, and it's a very good book for the Big Van Book Club, a book club that highlights Vancouver writers. And of course, on Thursday, we will have a very spooky version of the Rydell Show, which is where we write stories together. But we're going to do some of our old games, but with, of course, spookier prompts and try to do some more horror stuff. So do come by, because we had a lot of fun with that last year. And this is sort of a big month for storytelling. So if this was ever a time for you to follow a channel that has storytelling and a storyteller on it, this would be the time. I won't belabor you anymore. Thank you very much for coming. I will keep the fire warm and the door ajar.